as a result of Ukraine's resistance to its military superior neighbor. Experts have begun predicting what will happen to Russia, and more importantly, to Russia's President Vladimir Putin. The Russian invasion of Ukraine began more than a year ago. Millions of people have left the nation, while others have stayed to fight. Analysts estimate that approximately 200,000 Russian troops have been wounded or killed in the war so far, although neither side has recently released totals. 30,000 civilian deaths and approximately 100,000 combat-related fatalities or injuries have occurred in Ukraine. Yet neither Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, nor Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, shows any signs of giving in and ending one of the biggest military conflicts since the end of World War II. That implies that the suffering and bloodshed caused by the war have no apparent end for the civilians caught in the crossfire. Russia has continued to exert pressure by hitting Ukraine's cities and infrastructure with missiles and drones. Putin, who is already miffed at his military's underwhelming performance in what he calls a special military operation, cannot afford to be perceived as giving up on a battle that he initiated and, by his estimations, should have been able to easily win. The stakes are at least high for Zelensky. According to a survey conducted in September, Ukrainians are adamantly opposed to giving Russia more territory. Putin can also not afford to politically sign a deal that requires him to give up any territory. Putin stalked his whole political career on the annexation of Crimea, and that he isn't about to give it up so easily. Zelensky has stated openly that his nation's forces will retake Crimea. The Ukrainian government believes that this action would spark a coup against Putin and ultimately secure Ukraine's borders. Vladimir Putin will not succeed in either his grandiose original goal of establishing a puppet regime in Kyiv or his fallback goal of annexing all of southeastern Ukraine, though it is still impossible to predict when and how the war in Ukraine will end. Even holding on to the areas he controlled before the February 2022 invasion appears to be a challenging, if not completely impossible task. Although Mr. Putin's myth is irreparably damaged and his system of rule is deteriorating, he could theoretically survive defeat, and the future of Russia after Mr. Putin is equally uncertain. The fate of Crimea, that speed of that victory, and Western policies will be three main factors that will matter. After all, Mr. Putin is aware that any leader who cannot control Crimea is unlikely to control the Kremlin. Even though it is technically Ukrainian, many Russians believe it should be theirs. The possibility of a direct Ukrainian offensive into Crimea could easily frighten Mr. Putin, who tends to make hasty decisions and overact in an awkward way when he does, into some dangerous escalation. But if it simply becomes impossible to maintain because the Ukrainians can cut the peninsula's land, sea, and bridge connections, he will be faced with an almost insurmountable political dilemma. Another factor that could be crucial is how quickly the Russians were defeated. Ironically, it might not be the case that the faster the process is, the better it is for the world and Ukraine. A sudden collapse of the Russian lines could also frighten Mr. Putin into escalating the situation, either by using tactical nuclear weapons or by ending the 180,000 or so conscripts he has so far withheld for political reasons. If everyone in the nation is viewed as Mr. Putin's willing accomplice in aggression and abuse, this helps him. The idea that Russians must resist because the West simply despises them is at the heart of his propaganda, which the sanctions regime has ironically only served to reinforce. Additionally, it ensures that when he does leave, a new generation of nationalists will probably emerge. Mr. Putin's constitution, or the Russian people, will ultimately decide when he will step down. So smash that like button if you haven't already. He is, after all, failing both at home and on the battlefield in the meantime. At the time, Russians were urged to support constitutional amendments that would allow Vladimir Putin to continue in office for an additional 16 years. The news anchor portrayed President Putin as a sea captain navigating the good ship Russia through rough seas of international unrest to win over the public. Ukraine has suffered death and destruction as a result of Vladimir Putin's invasion. His nation has suffered significantly military losses as a result. Some estimates place the number of dead Russian soldiers in the tens of thousands. Russian prisoners have been recruited to fight in Ukraine, and hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have been recruited as soldiers. The war is still a threat to the security of Europe and the world. and it affects global energy and food prices. However, the leader of Russia has not yet admitted that invading Ukraine was a mistake. Pushing forward, escalating, and raising the stakes is Mr. Putin's approach. He continues to paint Russia as an innocent bystander and blames America and NATO for the conflict in Ukraine. And yet, in his early years in office, Vladimir Putin gave the impression that he did not see NATO as a threat. Even in 2000, he did not rule out the possibility of Russia joining the alliance in the future. President Putin responded, "Ukraine is a sovereign state and is entitled to choose its own way to ensure its own security." When asked about Ukraine's stated intention to join NATO 2 years later, from this point forward, Putin only has 3 choices. Each would have an impact on markets. First, Putin would be wise to file suit as soon as possible. The most likely outcome at this point seems to be a complete reversal of Russian gains, as Russian forces in Ukraine weaken over the winter. The domestic political repercussions of what would then undoubtedly be a devastating military defeat, however, would leave Putin exposed if he waited for this possibility. Putin may be able to save some face by limiting Russian casualties during an early withdrawal during some sort of peace process. Additionally, he may be able to negotiate sanctions that are less harsh on the Russian economy. Putin's continued presence would result in limited sanctions moderation and strained relations with the West. Second, a much more positive scenario would see Ukraine triumphant and Putin ousted, most likely through an internal uprising. A popular uprising would be less likely, though it is possible that it could occur in the future, particularly if Putin tries to prolong the war. Of course, there are worries about Putin's followers. The following individual will probably be someone who is currently a part of the inner circle of the Kremlin, but who wants to normalize relations with the West. Sanctions will be tempered if this occurs, and Putin loses his position as president. The third and worst possibility is that Putin would follow through on his nuclear threat. He might make use of tactical nuclear weapons to try to stop any Ukrainian offensives, and once more, force the Ukrainian side to the negotiating table. Tactical nuclear weapon use, however, is challenging in actual use. As military experts have noted, they may not result in definitive military victories. They put occupied territory in Russia at risk, and they will cost Russia a lot politically. Although a nuclear attack by Russia would undoubtedly be a major security incident that would immediately increase global risk and uncertainty, a nuclear war outcome is unlikely. The world market would likely drop if Russia took nuclear action. With a flight to high-quality assets, there would likely be a sharp increase in commodity prices, a collapse in global growth, and losses in risky assets. The likelihood of a globally systematic event would increase already high levels of worry about the global housing crisis. Regrettably, Vladimir Putin has almost complete control over which of these 3 possibilities materialize, and that's why you should smash that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Last week, the Speaker of Russia's lower house of parliament stated, "As long as there's Putin, there's Russia." It wasn't a statement of fact, just a pledge of loyalty. Russia will survive. It has done so for many years. However, the outcome of the Ukrainian war now directly affects Vladimir Putin's fate. See you in the next video.